We're surrounded by so many messages telling us that we've got to hustle, that we've got to strive, that we've got to do everything we can to be successful, that we've got to build a platform or build a business, and that success is always measured by numbers. And yet, when you go to the Word of God, you find out that that is not necessarily the case. Instead, God says that if you want to be great in God's kingdom, you've got to be the servant of all. That if you want to be first, you've got to be willing to go last. That the way up is the way down. It's completely counterintuitive to our human nature and definitely counterintuitive to the wisdom of this world. I love what Mother Teresa once said. God did not call me to be successful. He called me to be faithful. But do you know what? Sometimes God kisses our obedience and our faithfulness with His favor, and He uses it in ways that we could never have dreamed. In the last video, I talked about how God called me to write and the process that He took me on to being published with my first book. It was a wedding gift book, and everyone at the publisher was so excited about it, and so was I. And yet, one thing after the other happened. First of all, it was delayed at the publisher. Secondly, when it was finally in our hands, we noticed that the font was really light and kind of hard to read. The award-winning gift book designer that they had hired, it turned out a lovely book, but they also used that same exact template, color scheme, and branding for about 6 other books that were released at the same time. Well, needless to say, that book didn't do very well in the market, but they had offered me a contract to write a second book, and so I was head down working on that book as hard as I could. But you know, in publishing, if an author's first book doesn't do well, they're really not able to designate a lot of funds to promoting that second one. I didn't know that, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't. Because again, my calling is not to be successful, it's just to be faithful. And so over that next year, I began to write the book. Writing Having a Merry Heart in a Martha World involved about a year of living in a wind tunnel filled with words and ideas, a year of insomnia. It was a difficult task. I remember just praying that I would write the words, the end. But it was kind of interesting because my father, God just gave him a gift of faith for that book. From the very beginning, whenever he would pray for me as I was writing, he would pray, and Lord, help it sell 1 million copies. Well, let me tell you, I thought, that's crazy, Dad, but thanks for believing in your daughter. I'm glad you have faith. He was believing God for 1 million copies. I was just praying that it would somehow make sense. I remember when I read that final copy after that year of writing and actually kind of breaking into tears because I thought, I think it does make sense, Lord. I think that you have helped me get these words on a page. But really, the only thing within my control was the writing of the book. What God did with it afterward was really up to Him. And I think that's important to remember as Christian creators. We're living in a culture where so much is dependent on us. But God called me to a different path from the very beginning. He had me on what I call a short leash. He made it clear that I wasn't to have a website. I wasn't to be on social media. I didn't even have an email list. Instead, God just said, put your lunch in my hands. Let me use it the way I see fit. And I'm really glad that He did that because He really is such a good shepherd. God knew that He was going to take me into a season where I simply wouldn't have the bandwidth to do any of those things online. I thought it was just going to be a 6-month sabbatical, a little bit of a break from writing before I started the next book. That's what publishing wisdom suggests, is that you have a new book every year. But what I thought was going to be a 6-month sabbatical turned into a 6-year journey that included a dark night of the soul, coming out of the dark night of the soul to find out I was pregnant unexpectedly at 40, which took me back into a dark night of the soul. And yet during that difficult time, God was doing something so deep and so profound that I can honestly say I would go through it 1,000 times just to experience the deep, deep soul surgery that God did inside of me. I had no idea that 6-year journey would lead to a sequel called Having a Merry Spirit, allowing God to change us from the inside out. Interestingly enough, during that 6 years, God had sovereignly kissed Having a Merry Heart in a Martha world with his favor, and it slowly, but then increasingly began to sell to the point that 6 years later, when Having a Merry Spirit came out, Having a Merry Heart in a Martha world was on the top of the bestsellers list. I remember going to a big bookseller convention and everyone saying, "How did you know? That was so brilliant. That is incredible marketing." And I'm just thinking, I didn't know. I had no idea. That was God the whole way along. And here's an interesting thing. I actually had dinner with the vice president of marketing from my publisher, and we were just talking about how amazing it was what God had done with the book. And she said, I just feel kind of bad. We really didn't do a lot to promote the book in the beginning. And I said, I know. And isn't that amazing? I didn't either. It was God from beginning to end. From the moment Having a Merry Spirit came out, I felt God prompting me to create a website, to begin to show up on social media, not to build a platform or to sell more copies of books, but because God was saying, it's time, Joanna. I have a new season for you. And yet, can I be honest? I've released other books and Bible studies since that time that have not sold 1 million copies. And that can be kind of frustrating at times because I work really hard to show up and do the things that you're supposed to do as a writer. But God constantly reminds me, really, Joanna? Do you want to do this in the arm of the flesh? Do you want to, after having begun in the spirit, try to finish this journey as a writer in the flesh? And I go, oh no, Lord, no, you are the best marketer of all times. I just want to partner with you. And that's really the secret. Whatever God's called you to do, put that little lunch that you've packed in his hands and allow him to bless it and break it and make it enough to feed a multitude. But let the number of that multitude be up to him. God bless you, my friend.